Hello, my name is Omar and the goal of this video is to help you understand more of what the Windows subsystem for Linux is and how we are able to develop programs with this subsystem through Microsoft's Visual Studio Code. Now, first of all, what is the Windows subsystem for Linux? The Windows subsystem for Linux, WSL for short, is a Windows 10 feature that lets you run Linux commands like your popular change directory or make directory to more graphical command line tools. Now, you may ask yourself why we would want or need a Linux environment on Windows. A Linux environment helps developers that work with Linux native tools like Ruby and Python, and developers that work on open source projects. This system allows these developers to be able to use tools on Windows. Another example comes from personal experience. Since I'm almost graduating from SDSU in computer science, I began the major not knowing that Linux was the standard for developers. The little programming that I learned was in high school, and it came from a web-based application, so using a Linux-based machine for all my programming never crossed my mind. That is, until I got to the upper level classes, where my professors had us work and develop our assignments out of a Linux-based environment. Since I had a Windows machine, it was difficult to get set up with an environment where I could use Linux tools like SSH to connect to the school's remote server, but luckily, the Windows subsystem for Linux made it extremely simple for me to keep up with my assignments, and hopefully it can help you as well. Before we download a Linux distro and get set up with Visual Studio Code, we have to make sure that we enable the Windows subsystem for Linux feature. To do that, we need to open Windows PowerShell and input the following string. So let me go ahead. Enable Windows optional feature online feature name Microsoft Windows subsystem Linux. So let's go ahead and run that. Okay, so we get an error that says the requested operation requires elevation. This is because you have to have administrator level access to be able to enable the feature. So let's go ahead and close this and open PowerShell again, but this time we'll do it as administrator. So run as administrator here on the right hand side. We're going to click yes, and we'll run that same string. This optional feature. Name soft. So let's go ahead and run that again. Okay, so it is running now. Now mine was really quickly because I already have the feature installed, but when yours finishes running, it's going to prompt you to restart your computer. So why don't we go ahead and do that before we continue on. After we restart our computer, we are ready to install a Linux distro. To do this, you can just navigate to the Microsoft Store to find your distro of choice. Now I'm going to type WSL for Windows Subsystem for Linux, and here you can see the selection of Linux apps made by Windows, so you can get the best experience in a Linux-based environment that Windows can give you. I will be using Ubuntu for this video. I'm not going to download it again because I already have it, so let's go ahead and open it up. Now when you open yours up for the first time, you're going to be prompted to create a new username and password. The username can be whatever you want it to be, and it does not need to match your Windows username. After you do this, you can close it and open the distro again, and it won't ask for the password that you created after you open it, kind of like how it happened to me here. The password prompt is saved for when you run a process in sudo mode, which basically means root mode or as administrator. To give the quickest of tours here on the shell, you can do typical Linux commands such as ls to find anything that's in your current folder. As you can see, nothing is in there. So let's go ahead and create a quick directory here. So let's make dir. We're going to call this hello. So if I ls again, notice that I have a directory now named hello. So let's go in there and let's create a file. Now if I ls again, you can see that the file is there. Now let's write to this file. I will be using vim or vi to edit this file. If you have not heard of Vim or VI, I don't blame you. Vim is a great built-in text editor for Linux, but it has a steep learning curve to it. This is why we'll be learning how to code in Visual Studio Code so that we are more efficient in our development. Let's get in here. Alright, so all I'm going to do is I'm just going to type hello world, and I'm going to save and exit out of that. Now I will cat the file to see the changes that we made to the file. And here we go. So you might be wondering where Windows keeps these files. They're located in a special mounted folder. So I can actually try to ls, even though it didn't show up in our initial ls. So this is my mounted folder. If I ls, notice that we have a C and an F folder. So let's try to ls into the C folder. So we got some denied permissions here, but these files here look like typical Windows files. So everything is still in Windows, although the files and folders we create inside of the Linux shell, inside your Linux distro, are thought of as separate on the window files. Now it's time to download Visual Studio Code. To download VS Code, just go to the Visual Studio website, code.visualstudio.com, and just click on the link and follow it from there. You can follow the steps as they are presented to you. Everything should be pretty standard. One thing I do recommend is that you add VS Code to your path variable. It is part of the installation process, so you should be fine if you check that box while installing. Just make sure to keep an eye out for it. And the reason we want to add VS Code to the path variable is so that we can easily access VS Code from our Linux shell. I'll demonstrate that in a bit later. For now, once you're done installing VS Code, let's go ahead and open it up. Here. You should get a similar welcome screen as I do here. And notice on the bottom right here, a pop-up showed up prompting us to install an extension, Remote WSL, because VS Code detected that we have enabled that feature. So let's go ahead and install this really quickly. Okay. So here on the left, you can see that my extension was installed successfully. You can see there by the star there. And this is essentially all we need in order for us to start developing in Linux. So what this extension does, it does a lot of the heavy lifting. So we don't have to worry about all those ugly steps. So now let's go back to our shell here. Let me go ahead and clear all that. Okay, so let's create another folder. We'll call this remote test. And all you need to do to get to this folder inside of VS Code is simply navigate to the folder. So let's do that real quick. And then we're going to type code space period. And what this is going to do, it's going to prompt VS Code to look for all the components it needs for the folder to be able to be ran inside of VS Code. So let's go ahead and type that in. So as you can see, it's installing a VS Code server. Let's give it some time, and this is where the path variable comes into play. So Ubuntu tells Windows to look for VS Code in the path variable so that it can grab the stuff that it needs. Okay, so now as you noticed, it opened a new window here. So let me maximize that, and you can tell that we are in the Windows Subsystem for Linux. If you look on the bottom left here, this little green tab with WSL Ubuntu tells me that we are editing on WSL Ubuntu. Perfect. So we're almost done with our setup. Lastly, before I start to work on a simple example, I want a terminal window because I don't want to keep switching from VS Code to my Ubuntu shell. So let's go ahead and do that. I do that by typing F1, and you can just say terminal because that's what we're finding, and we just click on create new integrated terminal. So if you notice, this little signature here matches what our Ubuntu shell sort of is. So that's essentially all we need to get started here. One thing I do want to recommend is that you play around with Visual Studio Code because, you know, the extension that we installed is not the only extension that is out there. If you wanted to work on different technologies, maybe Python, maybe some other things, I can guarantee you that Visual Studio Code will have an extension for that, or if not, um, someone in the community will. So just play around with it, see what feels good for you. But now let's go ahead and start our simple program. I'm going to create a file here, this icon. I'm going to call it, it's going to be your simple hello world, and we're going to code this in C. So notice how the icon changed here on the left to a C. So let's go ahead and create that. And if you notice here, another pop-up showed up saying that the C++ extension is recommended for this file type. So VS Code is always looking out for us, so let's go ahead and install that. Okay, so we got that going. Let's go back to my file explorer. So now let's write the simple hello world program. So include that, then we're just going to do int main, and then we're just going to do printf hello world. Alright, so as simple as you can get. So let's go ahead and save this. And because this terminal is a bash terminal, as you can see here on this on the right hand side here, so we have to use a specific GCC, and we're just going to type our file here. So let's see what happens. Okay, so notice how it says command GCC not found. We have to install GCC itself, because when we installed our Ubuntu shell, it was completely blank. There was nothing installed on it. So let's go ahead and do that. So this is where your sudo comes in. We need to install this as an administrator, and it's going to prompt me for a password. Let me type that in real quickly. Okay, and now it's going to install GCC. And this is where your password prompt comes in to play here. And I would recommend you try to look at the most common tools that you need to be able to run Ubuntu or any Linux shell efficiently. But you know, the tools come with the experience, so I guess just try to dive head on in and see what feels right for you. And as we let this finish up, this VS Code and Linux in particular don't only support C, support many variety of languages like I mentioned earlier. You know, we got Python, we got Ruby, we can make Flask web apps which are Python based through VS Code, and this is why a lot of web developers favor running or testing their apps through Linux, just because of the ease of commands. The command line tools are really easy to learn, and because it's almost universal, it's better to just know the commands that other people are working with, just so you're able to communicate better between developers. And we'll wait for this to finish up. Alright, so GCC seems to be downloaded and installed. So let's try this again. So we're going to do GCC hello world.c. Now we're good. Now let's try to run that. And there we go. We got that hello world. So this is essentially all you need to get set up with the Windows subsystem for Linux and VS Code. If you don't feel like using command line like this, I would highly recommend it. You know, VS Code is nice and sleek. But anyway, that's going to do it for me. Thanks for listening. I'll link some of the tutorials in the description below, and I'll see you on the next one.